If you want the sort of short definition of capitalism, it's a system to avoid paying its bills. It's a way of regulating and shaping the relationships between humans and between humans and the rest of life on Earth. It didn't used to be the case that you could get a burger or a nugget or a bunch of chicken nuggets for €1 or €2. Back in the 19th century, English workers were paying 80–90% of their income on food. And so now that we pay merely 20%, something's changed. And the chicken nugget ends up being a fantastic way of showing all the ways that capitalism dodges its bill in one small, strange thing. So let me run through the 7 things. Number 1, it's cheap nature, which means we feel free to take a chicken from the wild and breed it so that it is basically a machine for producing meat. That approach to nature is indicative of how capitalism operates. The second thing is work, because to turn a chicken into a nugget, you need to exploit workers, and chicken and poultry workers around the world are paid very badly, no matter where they are. The third thing is cheap care, because once the chicken workers' bodies are broken, who's going to look after them? Usually it's gendered women's work, it's community work to look after these broken bodies, and you can't have cheap chicken without a safety net for the people you discard from that production line. The fourth thing you need is, in fact, cheap food. The chickens need to be fed. In the United States, they're given billions of dollars of subsidy every year just for the feed alone, and cheap food is also vital for workers. On top of that, you need cheap energy in order to fuel the poultry production facilities, to be able to run the machinery. You need cheap money, because in order for the engine of capitalism to work, you need low interest loans, and big business get low interest loans from governments all the time. And finally, you need cheap lives, because no matter how little you pay workers and how little you care about consumers, at some point you have to recognize that it's women and people of color who are discriminated against in the production of this food. And then, of course, you can treat your consumers as disposable too. If they develop dietary diseases as a result of eating your food, that doesn't matter so much, because that's not a life you have to care about. So if you've heard of the Anthropocene, you've heard of this idea that there's things that are happening in the world for which humans are responsible. Things like by 2050, there will be more plastic in the sea than fish, for instance. And if there's any civilization after humans, what they'll see is all the plastic, and they'll see the radioactivity from the weapons tests, and they'll see the chicken bones. There's something that drives humans to create this situation. And if you call it the Anthropocene, you misidentify the root cause of this. It's not all humans whose behavior has resulted in the 6th extinction. There are many civilizations on Earth today that are not responsible for the 6th extinction. In fact, that do a great job of managing natural resources and of working well together and of surviving and thriving. And many of those civilizations are indigenous communities, usually forest communities. But there is one civilization that really is driving this, and that civilization is the one whose relationships between each other and nature is called capitalism. So instead of calling it the Anthropocene, let's call it the Capitalocene, because that way we can identify what is actually driving us towards this state shift of the planet. It's not all humans, and it's not something that is intrinsic to being human that is making this happen. It is something about the social system in which certain humans find themselves that is perpetuating and driving us towards this such dramatic shift of the planet that it will be written into the fossil record for as long as this planet exists. This is so difficult. Well, look, I was talking to my students about how we've got really until 2030 to move to a zero-carbon economy. And they look at me like, what does that even mean? How do we get anywhere near that? And in part, that despair and cluelessness is a symptom of the success of capitalism in inhabiting our minds and aspirations. And that's why it's much easier for people to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Because you can go to the movies now and see the end of the end of the world, right? You can go to the movies and see some apocalyptic explosion and the remains of cities. But what you can't see is different human relations with respect to the world and nature. And yet, of course, there are civilizations alive now that are practicing different relationships between humans and nature. Whether those civilizations are indigenous people in forest communities, or even, I live in the United States, where every morning my children are taught to say that they live in one nation under God. But the United States legitimately recognizes hundreds of nations of indigenous people. And we have to work to forget that. That's why children are taught every day that there's only one nation, even though legally in that country there are hundreds. And so every day we are taught to forget that there are different ways of doing things, that there are different nations, that there are other possibilities for us. And so it's not surprising that then when I say, well, let's think about what other nations might be doing, people are like, what other nations? We're in the United States. There's only one country, USA, USA, USA. And that is capitalism inhabiting our minds and preventing us from thinking through what other possibilities are, even if those possibilities are right in front of us. There are places that you can go online and find out what your ecological footprint is. And you'll get asked questions like, well, what do you eat every day? And are you vegetarian? And do you take public transport or do you drive? And what kind of a house do you live in? I'm down with the idea that we need to be consuming less. And I think that that's right, particularly if you live in the global north and the lifestyle that you have been accustomed to is premised on a great deal of exploitation around the world. However, to present capitalism as a lifestyle choice is to mistake a system for, to blame the individual for a system. If you're just saying, look, we can overcome climate change and the capitalism that produces it through recycling, then you're underestimating two things. You're underestimating how big a problem this is, but you're also underestimating your own power. Now, this is not to say, hey, you could do more than recycling. But it's to say, hey, if you're interested in systemic change, you can't do that by shopping differently. The way that you are powerful is not by what you put in your basket, but it's how you organize to transform society. And that's the only way society has ever changed. No one has shopped for an end to slavery. Nobody went out and bought the right thing so that women could vote. And so when you get the ecological footprint and you're like, well, maybe you should just consume a little less and write to your elected representative, that's often bullshit because your elected representative has been bought by a fossil fuel company. Mine has. And I live in Texas, so I know what that's like. The only way that change is going to come to Texas is when people organize. But it's not just Texas. I believe that you also have fossil fuels in France and some very powerful fossil fuel companies here. Organizing for change against them is going to be dramatic. But the only way you fight the power of the fossil fuel companies in France is through organizing, not through shopping less.